Hello everyone. Welcome to our video session for this week. So this week we're going to start talking about quantitative research. So to begin the discussion this week, we're going to focus on a few things as we sort of set the foundation for moving forward with different kinds of statistical tests and different concepts that we need to learn for quantitative research. So let's take a look at some of the things that we're going to discuss today. So we'll talk about what quantitative research is. We'll kind of give a definition and we'll talk about what it focuses on. We also tonight will talk about variables and we'll talk about hypothesis testing. Okay, so that will set the foundation for us moving forward for different concepts that we'll discuss in future sessions. So the first thing that we need to understand, and this is something that we have talked about in class before, but it is one methodology for designing research studies. So we've often talked about this in class. We have quantitative studies, we have qualitative studies, and we have mixed methods studies. Okay? With quantitative research, we focus primarily on using numbers and statistics. Right? So we've talked about this in many times in our class sessions before, that if we don't see numbers, if we don't see statistics, then it's likely not quantitative, right? That's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for numbers and statistics and charts and graphs and all kinds of things like that. Think to yourself, what are some of the things that you have noticed about quantitative research? Perhaps it is difficult to read and understand. That's a common sentiment. Perhaps there are really sophisticated statistics, particularly in high-level research articles that you might find. There is sort of a very rigid structure for many quantitative articles. So some of those are some of the characteristics that you might find. You might also think to yourself, where might this type of methodology be appropriate or not appropriate? As an example, if you're wanting to understand a group of people or a population of people, then quantitative research might be appropriate for you. However, if you're wanting to understand the opinions and thoughts and feelings of just a couple people, or maybe just even 10 or 12 people, then quantitative research is not going to be appropriate for you, right? It doesn't make sense to get an average of, say, the attitudes of 6 people. That's not really going to tell you very much. All right. So there are good things about quantitative. There are bad things about quantitative, and its usefulness is it depends on the situation and it depends on the questions that you're asking. Okay. So let's dive right in. Let's first talk about variables. And we're going to talk about several different ways to describe variables, and these are things that probably you have talked about before in other classes that you perhaps have taken. If you've taken a statistics class or any kind of research class before, you have talked about many of these kinds of things. So variables basically are the substance of quantitative research. They make up quantitative research. Without variables, we don't have quantitative research, right? And so variables are basically the substance. They're the building blocks of quantitative research. So let's look at just a very simple example here. On the screen, you see a coffee mug. Now, we can describe this coffee mug in a lot of different ways. And if we break down all of those components, we start to end up with variables. So we can think about color. Color would be a variable, right? In this instance, the coffee mug is white with blue stripes. We could talk about the weight of the coffee mug. So the weight could be measured in pounds, it could be measured in kilograms, grams, whatever. But we have the weight. We have the mass of the coffee mug. We have the age of the coffee mug. We have the volume of the coffee mug. So how much coffee can fit inside the coffee mug. We have all kinds of things that describe this coffee mug, right? All of these things are variables. They can vary, okay? That's why a variable is called a variable, because it varies. Could this coffee mug be red? Sure. Could this coffee mug be brown? Sure. All right, so color can vary. Could this coffee cup weigh more or less? Absolutely. Could it have more or less volume? Certainly. Right, so these things vary. That's why they're called variables, right? Some variables vary more than others, and some vary less than others, but these are all variables. So these all make up how we would describe this coffee mug. In the same way, we have variables for individuals, we have variables for organizations, we have variables for teams. So in our case, we talk about things like engagement, or job satisfaction, or motivation, or personality, or things like that. Those are all variables that can describe an individual, right? And those are the kinds of things that we are most interested in human resources. Okay? So variables, kind of the substance of what we do. All right? We can talk about variables in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that we describe variables is that variables can either be independent or dependent. One of the most important things to realize about dependence versus independence is that there's not necessarily an inherent quality of a variable that makes it dependent or independent. What determines that is your study. Okay? So what do I mean by that? We might look at personality, and we might say that inherently someone has a personality. So you are extroverted, you're introverted, maybe you're conscientious, whatever. So we can describe your personality, and most of us would probably say, well, you know, as a variable, personality, particularly in an organizational setting, personality is independent, right? For example, if we wanted to determine the relationship between personality and salary, we could do that, and we could say that perhaps personality has some sort of influence on your salary. Maybe if you're more outgoing, you have a higher salary. Maybe if you're more introverted, maybe that means you have a higher salary, right? So we can say personality influences salary. But if we flip that, if we go the other way and we say salary influences your personality, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Salary may influence your behaviors, but it's probably not going to influence your personality, right? So in that sense, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to say it that way. At the same time, personality could be defined as dependent on other things. Personality might be defined as dependent on the family situation in which you were raised. It could be dependent upon genetics. It could be dependent upon parenting style, right? So personality, the variable personality in and of itself, is not inherently dependent nor independent. The study itself, the question, determines that relationship. Okay? This relationship is also described as having to deal with two or more variables, right? So when we talk about, if I said, is personality an independent or dependent relationship, your answer should be, number one, it depends. But two, you cannot determine the answer if all I ask about is personality. It has to be in relationship to something else, okay? So really dependent and independent is almost like it's describing the nature of the relationship rather than the variable itself. I hope that makes some sense. Let me kind of describe this a bit further, and I'll give you some examples that might help highlight this for you. So what we say is changes in the independent variable affect the dependent variable. So variable A affects variable B. Again, in our example, personality and salary. Let's say that personality is variable A. Personality affects variable B. So if you change personality, you'll see a change in salary, right? That's called a dependent relationship. You have an independent variable, personality, that does not change based on B, okay? Remember that if you flip that around, it really doesn't make sense. So that gives you a clue as to the nature of that relationship. But again, A affects B. So personality affects salary. That's how you know who is independent, which variable is independent and which one is dependent. Personality affects salary. Okay, that's one way to think about it. Be careful here about inferring causality, though, because just because there's this relationship right here that describes dependence versus independence, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a causal relationship. Okay, what I mean by that is that we might say that there is a relationship between personality and salary. And by the way, I'm making that up. I don't know if there's a relationship or not. But you might be able to say that there is a relationship there. So personality and salary. but you might not be able to say that personality causes you to have a certain salary, right? You might not say that personality causes you to have a certain kind of job, but they could be related, right? So just be careful about inferring causality. And as we go through this presentation, I will bring this up again and again, this issue of causality. This is something you really need to pay attention to. All right, so let's look at some examples. These are some examples of studies that I've come across in the literature, and this is the purpose statement of each of these studies. So this one, first one, for example, this study proposes that evaluations of managerial potential by supervisors and peers differentially relate to the personality of the job candidate being evaluated. Now there are variables in this purpose statement, right? Let's see what they are. First, we have potential. So we're talking about the managerial potential of an individual as rated by supervisors and peers. That's important, but the variable itself is potential. What level of potential, how much potential do you have to be a manager in an organization? The next variable would be personality, okay? Now in this case you might say, well, which one would be dependent, which one would be independent? Again, think about which one makes sense. Remember that independent affects dependent. So variable A affects variable B, or causes a change in variable B. So would it make sense to say that potential, your managerial potential, could have some kind of effect or make some kind of change in personality? Probably not. So really what we're looking at here is personality as an independent variable and potential as a dependent variable. Okay? Let's look at the next example. We use the Elaboration Likelihood Model, ELM, from marketing research to explain and examine how recruitment message specificity influences job seeker attraction to organizations. So let's take a look. We have message specificity, so how specific a certain message is. So we're recruiting new people to the organization. How specific is that message? So the level of specificity, that's one variable. The next variable would be attraction to the organization. So as a job seeker, am I attracted to that organization? Does it seem like a good organization to work for, or not so much? So we have specificity and attraction. Okay, so let's see here. We want to know if which one is independent and which one is dependent. Okay, so we want to explain and examine how recruitment message specificity influences, and that's a key word here, attraction to organization. So in this case, the specificity of the message is independent and the attraction to the organization is dependent, because specificity will make a change in the attraction. So if we, for example, make the message more specific, we might see that people are more attracted to the organization, or perhaps less attracted. So they don't have to go together, right? They don't have to go more and more or less and less. Rather, it simply means independent versus dependent simply means there's a change. Any change is fine. So specificity might mean that more specificity might mean that there is less attraction to the organization. You still have a situation where specificity is independent and attraction is dependent. Let's look at our last example. The survey focused on project team leader behaviors, use of team building, and team member characteristics as predictors of project cost and scheduled performance. So we have several variables in this one, and this one's a kind of complicated. So let's take a look at these. First, we have team leader behaviors. That's one variable. So what are the kinds of behaviors that we're seeing in this team? So team leader behaviors. We also have the use of team building. So that's another variable. Next, we have the characteristics of the team members. And maybe there's several variables that could fall under that. But just for this purpose statement, we have one. So characteristics. Okay? Next, we have cost. So the project cost, how much did it cost in terms of dollars? And lastly, we have schedule performance. Was it on time? Was it late? Was it ahead of schedule? That would be schedule performance. Now, in this case, we have several variables. Multivariate is what we would call this. So we have several variables that would be happening in this purpose statement. So which ones are dependent? Which ones are independent? That's a kind of a tricky question. Okay. So let's look at the first three. We have behaviors, we have team building, and we have characteristics. Okay. Now, we could say that all of them are independent. We could say that all of them are dependent. We could say that there is a mix. Lastly, we have cost and performance. Notice the word in this statement where we say predictors. So we're looking at behaviors, team building, and characteristics as predictors of cost and performance. So that's kind of our dividing line. Predictors is kind of our dividing line. So on one side you have independent, on the other side you have dependent. Okay? So behaviors, team building, characteristics are independent. Cost and performance are dependent. Okay, so that's decided by the study, right? Predictors. We're seeing if these three things, behaviors, characteristics, team building, are predictors of cost and performance. Could you flip it the other way around and say, we want to know if cost and performance will predict behaviors, team building, and characteristics? Well, maybe, right, for some of them. So the project cost, how much it costs, and the performance, the schedule performance, well, is it on time, is it not? Can those two things predict how the team leader will behave? Maybe, right? You could maybe argue for that. Will they predict, could cost and performance predict the use of team building? I would say it's unlikely, right? But maybe you could argue for that. And would cost and performance predict the characteristics of the team members? I doubt it, right? That just doesn't seem to make sense. But again, this is determined by the study itself, not by are they inherently independent versus dependent. This is determined by the study. We look at lots of other variables too. We'll talk about some of them. But again, we've mentioned lots of these things. Engagement, satisfaction, turnover, training, number of hours in training, quality of training, the effectiveness, right? All of these different things are all kinds of different variables. So here are some other ways to describe variables. You probably have seen this before. So we have independent versus dependent. That's one way to describe them. Another way to describe them is categorical, continuous, or ordinal. So with a categorical or nominal variable, you have no inherent numerical value. And I'll give you some examples here in just a moment. With an ordinal variable, you do have rank order data, so you can rank them. But again, there's kind of not necessarily a specific number that you could attach to that, right? So it is rank ordered, but not necessarily, those numbers don't necessarily make mathematical sense, okay? With a continuous or interval variable, you have an intrinsic numerical value, but there's no true zero. Zero is arbitrary in this case. And then a ratio variable is a type of continuous variable, but it has a true zero. Okay, so let me give you some examples. So for categorical, you have gender, race, hair color, eye color, right? These are just categories. You can't really do any math around that. You can apply numbers to them, right? So you could say, for example, hair color. You could say brown will equal 1, and black will equal 2, and blonde will equal 3, and red will equal 4, etc. You could do that, but it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do that, right? You can't say, well, blonde hair minus brown hair equals red hair. That doesn't make mathematical sense. Similarly, ordinal is kind of the same way, except you now put a rank order to these things, right? So you can't really rank eye color, right? Green, brown, black, blue. You can't really rank those. But with an ordinal variable, you can rank things. So for example, grade level, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. But the distance, the mathematical distance between those, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? It's really not that important. You can say, for example, third grade is 2 grades ahead of first grade, but you can't say that, for example, someone in first grade, someone in third grade is 3 times as smart as someone in first grade. That doesn't really compute, right? So that's what we mean by a rank order, right? There is some structure to it, but the mathematical distance between them doesn't really make a lot of sense. Continuous or interval variable examples would be Celsius, Fahrenheit, or the date. Because there's no, the zero in these scales is arbitrary, right? Celsius, the 0 on the Celsius scale, the 0 on the Fahrenheit scale, it does not mean an absence of heat. It simply is an arbitrary 0, right? That is different from a ratio variable where you can have, where 0 means nothing of something. 0 means an absence of something, right? So age, you can have 0 age, you can have nothing, right? Height, mass, distance, you can have 0 of those things. If two things have no distance between them, they're touching, right? You can have 0 distance between two objects. In terms of temperature, you can have a 0 that's on the Kelvin scale, just as an aside, but it is so you would have, that's an absolute 0, that is the absence of heat. 0 heat is present there. But Celsius and Fahrenheit scales, that doesn't mean anything, right? 0 doesn't mean anything. Okay, so that's kind of how we describe variables, kind of in a nutshell, 2 different ways. So categorical, nominal, ordinal, continuous or interval, and ratio. So that's sort of one way to describe, and another way to describe is independent versus dependent. All right? Where do variables come from? In the social sciences, we make them up. Let's look at an example of employee engagement. When I say we make them up, you'll see what I mean by that. So there are several common surveys that we use to measure engagement. One of them is the UWES-9, the Utrecht Work Engagement Survey, the Q12, which is by the Gallup organization, and the Job Engagement Survey, JES. There have been other people, though, who've argued for other kinds of constructs as proxies for engagement. So, for example, they say, well, you know, if you're absent from work a lot, well, maybe that means you're probably not engaged in your job. So absenteeism is really more a better measure. Or they might say turnover. If your employees are turning over really quickly, they're not engaged in their job. There's other kinds, right? Well, how do we know which one's right? How do we know which one holds up? We do that through empiricism. So we do lots of statistical tests to determine different kinds of validity, different kinds of reliability, if things are generalizable, those kinds of things. Those are all different ways in which we know how to sort of suss out which of these is right and which is more reliable, and those kinds of things. Okay, so surveys, that's kind of the gold standard. That's the best way to get organizational data. It's really in some cases, the only way to get organizational data. But surveys are used a lot. It's the most commonly used method. We have to make sure that we're doing good surveys, though. So for your HAT project, you will, some of you who are interested or if your question lends itself to more of a quantitative type of approach, then you'll use a survey, most likely. But how do we make sure that we have a good survey? Well, it's based on a good theoretical framework, and it has good psychometric properties. So I'll tell you a little bit about psychometric properties in terms of surveys. 2 things we sort of describe in terms of having good psychometric properties, and this describes surveys. The first is reliability. And the question we ask with reliability is the survey consistent in its measurement of the construct? So again, employee engagement. Is the survey consistent? Does it consistently measure employee engagement? And if yes, then great. If no, then not great. The statistic that we use to measure this is called Cronbach's alpha. So the little symbol there is the Greek letter alpha. And when we compute this, if alpha is greater than 0.7, we determine that to be reliable. We determine that survey to be reliable. Okay? The next thing we think about is validity. Validity. Does the survey actually measure what we say it measures? We think about 3 main kinds. There are other kinds of validity, but these are the 3 main kinds that we look at: content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity. Now, each of these means something slightly different. What it basically means is, are we really measuring employee engagement, or, for example, are we measuring something else? All right, so if we define employee engagement as X, then does this survey actually measure X, or does it measure X and Y? Okay, so this is all talking about validity. Criterion validity really has to do with some outside criterion. For example, if you took the SAT or the ACT, what is that measuring? So that's measuring potential for achievement, right? So that would be sort of content validity or construct validity. It's measuring your potential for achievement. But it also should be related to something else, right? It should be related to, for example, your GPA or your college entrance something like that, right? So if, for example, it does not connect well with one of those things, and it should, then you don't have criterion validity. It should be connecting with other similar kinds of constructs, okay? So this is just kind of a general overview. We could dive into each one of these into a lot of detail, but this is just sort of surface level overview on two things. Just remember reliability and validity. Those are kind of two of the main ways to determine if a survey has good psychometric properties, okay? But surveys have issues. So think about this. Have you ever taken a survey where it says, how many times during a day did you engage in helpful behavior towards your employee? And then it gives you some responses. You could say a couple of times a day, a few times a day, several times a day. Maybe it's a couple times a week, or a few times a week, or several times a month, or whatever it is. Well, here's the issue. A couple can be defined in many different ways. Now, for me, when I hear the word a couple, I think of two, right? A couple. That means two things. But after surveying people in my classes and asking them, a couple can mean different things to different people. A few, for me, means maybe 3 or 4. Several, to me, means 5 or more. Once you get up to, say, 10, 9, 10 or so, that means, that's for me is many. So instead of several, you now have many of something. But that's just my interpretation, and it might differ from yours. So again, if we were both given a question and it said, how many times do you engage in helpful behaviors? And we both had in our mind 5, some of you might write, well, that's a few times a day. For me, it would be several times a day, right? So again, that can cause some confusion, and it can be difficult in interpreting the results of a survey. All right, so let's talk about now some hypothesis testing. And we're going to get into this a little bit later. So for next week, we'll talk about more of these kinds of things and the different kinds of tests that are more appropriate for different situations. So specifically, the statistical tests that we use for each. Okay. So with hypothesis testing and with the statistical tests that we use, we think about experimental versus non-experimental. For the bulk of what we do in social science research, it is non-experimental because experimental requires control groups and lots of time and lots of money and things like that. And so much of what we do is non-experimental. We also talk about correlation. Are two things related, and how are they related? So we talk about how closely they're related. We talk about the nature of the relationship. So if one goes up, does the other go up as well? If one goes down, does the other go up or down? And then how closely do they match each other? We think about comparisons as well. We can also look at longitudinal studies. Longitudinal means that you're doing something over time instead of looking at something cross-sectionally. For example, you do one survey at this time and you report those results. Rather, you would do a survey again and again and again and see how things change over time. And lastly, we think about descriptives. So we can simply report on percentages or counts or standard deviation, those kinds of things. So all of these things will be explored in more detail next time, and we'll talk about the different kinds of statistical tests that match with each of the different kinds of things that you might be interested in doing with variables. Okay? So let's wrap up. In summary, quantitative research is good when you're dealing with things that can be quantified in a meaningful way. But that's just it. Do we know what things can be quantified in a meaningful way? So things like turnover and number of hires and salaries and job ranks, those can all be quantified. But what about things like attitudes and emotions? What about things like motivation? Can we really quantify that in a meaningful way? Well, yeah, sort of. But there's still some limitations, and always will be, right? You can't just pop open my head, look inside my brain, and say, I have a motivation score of 4.3. That doesn't really work, right? And so we have to be careful about interpreting results. We often in social science take things that are difficult to quantify, so like I said, attitudes, emotions, behaviors even, and we attempt to measure them with numbers. But it's a flawed way of doing it. It's not an exact science. And then lastly, quantitative research is good for making generalizations. That's important to hold on to, is that quantitative research is really the best way in terms of understanding large groups of people, but it's not good for understanding small groups of people or getting really, really detailed on individuals. Okay, so that's our first kind of step into quantitative research. If you have questions about any of the materials covered in this session, please be sure and let me know.